In 1955, there was this absolutely massive, unbelievably complex masterpiece of a painting that just, well, vanished.
Completely disappeared.
Right, and it vanished into the Soviet Union, of all places. And this painting, it didn't feature, a serene pastoral landscape or like a traditional polite portrait.
No, not even close.
It featured this sprawling wooden table with actual flayed human legs.
Yeah, legs just bleeding from the wooden knots.
Exactly, bleeding from the knots. And sitting around this bleeding table was this incredibly bizarre cast of characters. You had a pet deer, her sister's children, and this towering papier-mâché Judas figure.
It is an intensely heavy image.
Oh, incredibly heavy. And the artist who painted it, she wasn't some tortured recluse hiding away. She was a radical. She was a communist. I mean, she was a woman who had recently housed and actually had a secret affair with Leon Trotsky.
Which is still just wild to think about.
It really is. Yet today, if you ask the average person, you probably know her best as this like cute sanitized cartoon on a canvas tote bag.
Or a coffee mug. Or a decorative floral planter.
Right, a floral planter. We are looking at a historical landscape today that is completely baffling when you hold it up against the mainstream narrative.
It really is. Because the world has taken one of the most viscerally intense, politically charged artists of the 20th century. And basically, they flattened her into a brand.
Flattened her completely. And that is exactly the disconnect we are tackling today. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Our mission today is to uncover the incredibly complex, highly intentional, and frankly, fiercely radical reality of Frida Kahlo.
We are moving far, far past the simplified pop culture caricature.
Yeah, the Frida mania, or the Kahlo cult, as the scholars in our sources call it. And speaking of sources, I am looking at this towering stack of documents we've compiled for this deep dive.
The sheer volume of material is staggering.
It really is. We have these deep academic feminist analyses, comprehensive art history breakdowns of her deeply codified symbolism, and even the intimate, highly personal records of her actual wardrobe.
Yet we are pulling from the literal contents of her famous home. We're cross-referencing medical documents with post-revolution Mexican political theory.
And examining the deliberate ways she constructed her own mythology, right? Because what truly marvels me, looking through all these documents, is how someone can possess one of the most instantly recognizable faces on the entire planet.
Oh, absolutely.
You see the unibrow, you see the floral crown, and you instantly know it's her. You just know.
You don't even need to see her name.
Exactly. Yet, her actual intellectual agency, her political fire, her sheer genius for self-mythologizing, it seems to be completely overlooked by the mainstream. We've literally turned a revolutionary into a logo.
A very profitable logo at that.
Very profitable. So how did the world completely erase the teeth of Frida Kahlo?
Well, to answer that and to really understand how she built that identity in the first place, we actually can't start by looking at her canvases.
Wait, really? Not the paintings?
No, because the canvases are the end product of a highly, highly controlled environment. Before we even touch the paint, we need to physically ground ourselves in the world she inhabited.
Okay, that makes sense.
And more importantly, the world she meticulously curated. We have to step inside La Casa Azul, the blue house.
The blue house, yeah. I'm trying to picture the space based on the architectural and historical descriptions we have here. The sources call it her intimate universe.
It was her entire world in many ways.
Right, and it's located in the Coyoacán suburb of Mexico City. And when the sources say the blue house, they mean a vivid, striking cobalt blue inside and out.
Oh, it is blindingly bright.
But what does that actually look and feel like when you walk through the front door?
Well, you are immediately hit by this sensory overload that is entirely by design. You step into the courtyard garden, and it is instantly populated with pre-Hispanic sculptures.
Just scattered around the garden.
Yeah, she and Diego Rivera collected these pieces. They were deliberately grounding the property in ancient Mexican heritage. And then the walls are that incredibly bright cobalt blue, which is actually a traditional color used to ward off evil spirits in Mexican folklore.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that about the color. That's fascinating.
Yeah. And then you walk into the kitchen, and it is lined with traditional yellow and blue tiles. There are tiny clay pots everywhere, wooden spoons.
Which was a choice, right?
A very deliberate choice. It was a complete rejection of the modern European-style stainless steel kitchens that were becoming super fashionable among the Mexican elite at the time.
So she was already making a statement just with her kitchen decor.
Exactly.
And she lived the vast majority of her life there, right? Like she was born there and she ultimately died there in 1954.
She did. And the phrase intimate universe is extremely literal. The house was preserved almost exactly as she left it when she died.
Just frozen in time.
Right, and specifically because she intended during her lifetime for it to become a museum.
So she knew. She was already curating her legacy.
She absolutely knew. It's a physical manifestation of her mind. When you look at the visual details of this space, you are looking at her internal architecture. But, the absolute center of gravity in that house, the room that really dictates everything we know about her, is the bedroom where she convalesced during the daytime.
The bedroom. Yeah, the bedroom features a very specific, almost haunting piece of furniture. It's a 4-poster bed.
Huh.
And mounted on the canopy, looking straight down at whoever is lying on the mattress, is a mirror.
It's a very large mirror.
Our sources explain her mother mounted it there for her after the bus accident she suffered in her youth. But I really want to unpack the medical reality of that accident.
We have to. It's the foundation of everything.
Because it seems completely foundational to everything she becomes.
The medical reality of 1925 Mexico is just crucial to understand here. She was 18 years old, riding a wooden bus in Mexico City, and it collided with a streetcar.
A wooden bus hitting a heavy streetcar, that's just a recipe for absolute devastation.
The physical destruction of her body was absolute. An iron handrail actually pierced her abdomen and exited through her pelvis.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Her spinal column was broken in 3 places. Her collarbone, her ribs, her pelvis, all shattered.
It's hard to even conceptualize that level of trauma.
And it gets worse. Her right leg, which was already weakened and thinner from a childhood bout of polio, suffered 11 fractures. Her right foot was completely crushed.
I mean, surviving that today with modern surgical interventions and pain management would be miraculous. But in the 1920s,
And it's something entirely different.
the sources describe her being encased in full-body plaster casts.
Just imagine the claustrophobia of that. Mexico City can be incredibly hot. You are 19 years old, your body is completely broken, and you are literally poured into a rigid plaster shell.
A shell that extends from your neck down to your waist and sometimes your legs, right?
Exactly. You cannot turn over. You cannot sit up. You are suspended in absolute stillness, entirely dependent on others, in just agonizing pain for months on end.
Which brings us back to that mirror on the canopy of the bed. If you are strapped down in a plaster cast, unable to move your head, the only thing you can look at is straight up.
Right. And straight up is a reflection of your own face.
The mirror forces this inward gaze. I mean, she didn't just decide one day, I think I'll paint some still lifes or maybe some landscapes. Her own image was literally the only landscape she had unrestricted access to.
She explicitly stated this later in life, actually. She said she painted herself because she spent so much time alone, and she was the subject she knew best.
The subject she knew best. That's so powerful.
The mirror on the bed is the perfect metaphor for her origin as an artist. She was forced into deep, unflinching introspection because she was physically trapped.
It's incredibly moving. And resting in that same bedroom today, which still contains her books, her toys, and a collection of dead butterflies pinned in glass cases, there's a pre-Hispanic urn.
Yeah.
And inside that urn are her ashes. She truly never left that room.
She never did. The atmosphere of La Casa Azul is heavy with that presence. But the story of the house and our understanding of Frida Kahlo as a whole, it actually shifted dramatically quite recently.
Right, because of the hidden archives.
Exactly. For 50 years after her death, massive portions of her life were kept entirely hidden. Diego Rivera mandated that certain rooms and trunks in the bathrooms of the house be sealed.
Just locked away from the world.
Locked away. And it wasn't until the period between 2004 and 2007 that these archives were finally unlocked and opened to historians.
I am reading the inventory list from that 2004 opening right now, and it is an absolute treasure trove.
Thousands of objects, right?
Thousands. They found highly personal medical documents, legal papers, textiles, exquisite Mexican silver jewelry, letters, newspaper clippings.
An absolute explosion of contact.
Exactly. Contacts that had been locked in the dark for half a century.
And unlocking those bathrooms forced the entire art history world to reevaluate her legacy. The contents completely shattered the dominant, almost fetishized narrative of Kahlo's life.
Okay, let's push back on that popular narrative right now, because the sources are very clear about how damaging it was.
Extremely damaging.
For decades, the story sold to the public was that Kahlo's life was purely a tragedy. It was a narrative defined entirely by what happened to her.
Right, the horrific bus accident that broke her body, and then the tumultuous, agonizing marriage to Diego Rivera that broke her heart.
Yeah, she was painted as this passive vessel of suffering, just weeping onto canvas.
The suffering was very real, we know that.
Mhm.
But characterizing her as passive is historically inaccurate.
Totally inaccurate. Opening the Casa Azul archives is like opening a time capsule that proves the exact opposite of that passive victim narrative.
Completely the opposite.
When you look at the thousands of meticulously saved letters, the deliberately altered clothing, the curated collections of jewelry, it proves she was the active, brilliant director of her own life.
She didn't just survive her reality, she orchestrated it.
Orchestrated it, yes.
She was highly strategic. Every item in those locked trunks reveals a woman who was acutely aware of the image she was projecting to the world.
And this intense curation of her physical space, this intimate universe of the Blue House, it extended directly onto the closest physical space of all, right? Her own body.
Her wardrobe.
Long before her paintings became internationally famous or hung in galleries, her wardrobe was her very first canvas for political and social rebellion.
I'm so glad we're talking about this.
I want to dive into this because the politics of presentation is a massive theme in these documents. When we talk about Frida Kahlo's fashion, we are not talking about vanity
Not at all.
or following trends. We are talking about armor, and we are talking about protest.
Yes.
I'm looking at a photograph in our stack here from 1926. It's a family portrait. Frida is a teenager here, and instead of wearing a demure dress like her sisters and her mother, she is wearing a dark, tailored, three-piece men's suit.
The visual impact of that photograph in the context of 1920s Mexico just cannot be overstated.
I mean, she made absolutely no attempt to soften the masculine silhouette.
None. Her hair is slicked straight back. She's exuding this quiet, immense confidence, standing slightly apart from the rigidly feminine presentation of her female relatives.
And women's suits in the 1920s, if they were worn at all, they were heavily tailored to nip in at the waist, right? To maintain a distinctly feminine hourglass shape.
Exactly. They were modified to be acceptable.
But she completely rejected that. She chose a broad-shouldered, straight-cut, masculine presentation. What is the historical consensus on what she was signaling here?
Well, she was subverting restrictive gender roles decades before terms like gender fluidity even entered the mainstream lexicon.
Way ahead of her time.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, right.
The archives show she read voraciously about European avant-garde movements and gender politics. By donning menswear, she was claiming the authority, the physical freedom, and the intellectual seriousness that Mexican society traditionally reserved exclusively for men.
But the paradox here is fascinating, because she wielded menswear to subvert expectations as a teenager. But later in life, she heavily embraced one of the most hyper-feminine silhouettes imaginable.
The Tijuana dress.
The Tijuana dress.
It is the image everyone immediately associates with her today. The vibrant, clashing colors, the voluminous floor-length skirts, the incredibly ornate embroidered square-cut blouses.
And those elaborate lace headdresses that frame the face almost like a halo.
Yes. But reading through the costume historians' analyses, this wasn't just some sudden shift in style. It had a profound dual purpose.
Let's talk about the practical necessity first, because it ties directly back to that bus accident we discussed.
The physical reality of her ruined spine and her legs required constant medical intervention. She had to wear incredibly rigid, heavy orthotic corsets.
Made of leather and steel, right?
Leather, steel, and later even solid plaster, just to be able to sit up straight in a chair. And her right leg was significantly thinner and shorter than her left, requiring a built-up shoe and heavy metal leg braces.
I see the genius in the clothing choice now. It operates almost like architectural cladding.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
The Tijuana dress is this beautiful, culturally resonant facade deliberately constructed to hold up and hide a crumbling foundation.
Exactly. The boxy blouses completely obscure the rigid lines of the steel corsets. The long, heavy skirts completely hide the leg braces and the discrepancy in her gait.
It allowed her to control exactly how much of her disability the public was allowed to see.
Right. She transformed medical necessity into a fashion statement so loud that people focused entirely on the embroidery and the colors, and they completely missed the steel scaffolding underneath.
That is so smart. But there was a second purpose to the Tijuana dress, right? One that was intensely, overtly political.
Highly political.
The dress originates from the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in southern Mexico, and our sources point out that this specific region is famously a matriarchal society.
Yes. Women run the markets there. Women control the finances. Women are the dominant cultural force.
So, by choosing the traditional clothing of these specific indigenous women, she was making a massive statement about female autonomy and economic power.
She was deliberately aligning herself with strength.
And the political context here is deeply tied to the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution. The country was trying to figure out its identity. The sources discuss a movement called mestizaje. How does her wardrobe fit into that?
So, following the revolution, the Mexican government actively promoted mestizaje, which was basically the celebration of Mexico's mixed-race heritage.
The blending of indigenous and European roots?
Right. They were trying to unite a heavily fractured country through a shared cosmic race identity. They were pushing back against the centuries of Spanish colonial rule that dictated that anything European was superior and anything indigenous was backward or, lower class.
Which makes her choice of clothing a deliberate middle finger to the European-leaning elite of Mexico City. But what's interesting is her own background. I mean, her father was a German-Jewish immigrant, Wilhelm Kahlo. Her mother was of Spanish and indigenous descent. Frida herself grew up in a middle-class suburb and had never even visited the Isthmus of Tehuantepec.
She didn't have to visit to understand the political utility of the garments. She claimed its matriarchal power and its indigenous pride as her own. She was consciously adopting a persona that aligned perfectly with her radical politics.
And she applied that exact same radical defiance to her own face.
Oh, yes.
She weaponized her natural features against the beauty standards of the time. If you look at 1920s and 30s fashion magazines, they were aggressively promoting Eurocentric beauty.
Pale skin, severely plucked, thin eyebrows.
And incredibly slim, delicate features. And Frida intentionally maintained her unibrow. She intentionally maintained the faint hair on her upper lip.
She didn't just maintain them, she accentuated them.
Wait, really?
Oh yeah. In her self-portraits, she used a specialized pencil to make the unibrow darker and thicker than it was in real life.
That is amazing.
It was a deliberate rejection of what a woman was, quote-unquote, supposed to look like to be considered valuable or beautiful by Western standards.
It was an act of visual resistance. She was telling the colonial, Eurocentric gaze that indigenous features, natural features, were not just acceptable, they were iconic.
The fashion, the unibrow, the architecture of the house is all inherently political.
It really is. And, just to level set with you, the listener, as we move into the actual mechanics of her politics, our goal today isn't to endorse or debate the merits of 1930s Marxism or global communism.
Right, exactly.
We are strictly following the historical paper trail provided in our sources, impartially exploring the facts of her life as they happened. And that paper trail makes it undeniably clear. To understand Frida Kahlo's art and her life choices, you have to understand her deep commitment to radical politics.
You can't separate the two.
You can't. She wasn't just a passive observer of history.
She was highly active. I mean, she was a precocious teenage member of the Communist Party of Mexico.
As a teenager.
Yes. And in her 20s, she was on the streets, actively leading union rallies alongside Diego Rivera.
I'm looking at these notes regarding her bedroom. She's famously wealthy, she's married to the most famous muralist in Mexico, and she's decorating the headboard of her bed, the exact same bed she was trapped in, with framed portraits of Marx, Engels, and Lenin.
Which is such a striking image.
How does that reconcile?
For Kahlo, the personal and the political were entirely inseparable. The suffering of the working class mirrored the literal physical suffering in her own body. She viewed capitalism and imperialism as destructive forces, and she aligned herself with the ideology she believed fought against them.
Her commitment was absolute.
Absolute, and it didn't wane with age or fame.
The sources highlight an event just 11 days before she died in 1954. She is incredibly sick at this point. She has just had her leg amputated due to gangrene.
She has severe bronchial pneumonia.
Her doctors completely forbid her from leaving her bed. Yet she insists on being pushed in a wheelchair through the streets of Mexico City to march in a massive protest against the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala.
It was her final public appearance. And when she passed away shortly after, her funeral became a highly political event.
Right. Her casket was placed in the center of the Palace of Fine Arts, and it was draped in a large red flag bearing a hammer and sickle.
She even painted the hammer and sickle directly onto the stiff plaster medical corsets she wore beneath her dresses.
That is just incredible dedication. But this brings us to a profound historical irony that our sources explicitly point out, and it's something that makes the modern treatment of her image so baffling.
The commodification.
The commodification, the sheer, almost absurd irony of a staunch, lifelong anti-capitalist communist becoming one of the most lucrative, multi-million-dollar capitalist commodities in the modern art and fashion world.
It is mind-bending.
The sources highlight this massive retrospective exhibition of her life at the Brooklyn Museum. Over 350 deeply personal objects on display. And who sponsored this tribute to a woman who draped her coffin in a communist flag?
Bank of America, Delta Airlines, and Revlon.
Revlon.
The inclusion of Revlon is particularly notable, actually. It was her preferred brand of pink lipstick, and the half-used tubes from her bathroom were literally on display in glass cases.
You're kidding.
No. The capitalist system she actively rallied against has completely absorbed her image, stripped it of its radical teeth, and sold it back to the public at a premium.
The article from The Independent in our stack points out an incredibly striking example of this cognitive dissonance. Theresa May, the former conservative Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, wore a Frida Kahlo bracelet while giving a major policy speech at a Conservative Party conference.
It perfectly highlights how mainstream culture loves the aesthetic of rebellion, but completely ignores the actual substance of it.
They want the bright floral crown, the bold eyebrows, the generic empowerment narrative.
Right, but they don't want the anti-imperialist politics, the raw physical agony, or the communist ideology that the woman wearing the crown actually bled for.
Exactly. And the friction between who she actually was and who the public wanted her to be, it started long before the modern era of coffee mugs and bracelets.
Oh, decades before.
The more she asserted her own stark, uncomfortable reality in Mexico, the more the European art establishment tried to put her in a neat, easily digestible little box. They didn't want a bleeding radical. They wanted a surrealist.
Which brings us to André Breton.
Yes, André Breton.
Breton was a French writer and poet, the self-proclaimed founder and father of the surrealist movement. He travels to Mexico in 1938, visits La Casa Azul, sees Kahlo's work, and immediately tries to claim her for his movement.
He famously and somewhat patronizingly described her art as a ribbon around a bomb.
Which sounds poetic, but it was incredibly reductive.
To understand why this was such a massive point of contention for her, we need to define what surrealism actually was in the 1930s.
Surrealism, as dictated by Breton's manifesto, was heavily focused on the irrational. It was an exploration of the deep unconscious mind, automatism, and the landscape of dreams.
Right.
The goal was to bypass the conscious, logical mind to reveal hidden psychological truths. Think of Salvador Dali's melting clocks. It's a deliberate detachment from waking reality.
And Kahlo fiercely, actively rejected this label. I mean, she was practically insulted by it. She stated very clearly, "I never painted dreams, I painted my own reality."
If we dive into the feminist art history sources we have, we can unpack exactly why her rejection of that label is so vital to her legacy.
Please do.
In the 20th century art canon, women were routinely marginalized. Their work was constantly dismissed as hobbyist or inherently less intellectual than men's work.
Diego Rivera is the perfect counterpoint here. Her own husband was hailed as a canonical genius muralist. His sweeping, massive frescoes depicting the history of Mexico were considered intellectually rigorous and historically important.
While Kahlo's reception by the mainstream media at the time was infuriatingly condescending.
It really was. The media treatment reflects the deeply entrenched patriarchy of the art world. I am looking at a quote from a 1938 review in Time magazine regarding her first solo exhibition in Manhattan.
Prepare yourself for this one.
They didn't call her a visionary. They didn't call her a master of self-portraiture. They dismissed her as black-browed little Frida, who gleefully dabbles in art because she was bored as hell sitting in a plaster cast.
Gleefully dabbles.
And a 1933 article from the Detroit News ran the headline, "Wife of Master Painter gleefully dabbles in works of art." Gleefully dabbles. She is literally painting her own miscarriages and her shattered spine, and they call it dabbling.
The establishment literally didn't have the vocabulary, or really the willingness, to process a woman painting visceral, bloody, unflinching portraits of female pain and biological reality.
So labeling her a surrealist was a mechanism of control.
Exactly. It was a way of softening her visceral truth It allowed male critics to look at a painting of a woman bleeding to death on a hospital bed and say, ah, what a fascinating, irrational dreamscape, rather than confronting the terrifying reality that this woman was in agonizing physical and emotional pain right in front of them.
Wow.
It completely distanced the viewer from her trauma.
I see. It's like someone watching a gritty, grueling, totally factual documentary about the actual painful events of your life, and then they stand up at the end, politely applaud, and call it a masterful fantasy film.
Yes.
They label it fantasy because the raw events are simply too intense, too uncomfortable for them to process as a reality someone actually has to live through.
That analogy perfectly captures what Breton and the Surrealists were doing to her. As the academic papers in our stack argue, her work was surreal without being surrealist.
Right.
She utilized non-traditional, highly symbolic, almost dreamlike compositions, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the subject matter was entirely rooted in the waking world, the physical body, and the political landscape.
So if she isn't painting dreams, how are we supposed to read these canvases? I mean, I'm looking at paintings with monkeys, floating beds, roots growing out of torsos.
You have to apply her logic to the work.
Right. If you do that, you stop seeing just a woman in a jungle, and you start reading a psychological blueprint. Because she didn't just paint pictures, she created a deeply codified, incredibly precise, symbolic vocabulary.
To understand her reality, you have to learn to speak the secret language she invented. Let's break down that visual dictionary, starting with the most confronting element of almost all her portraits.
The direct gaze.
The direct gaze. We talked earlier about how she stared down the camera in that 1926 photograph in the menswear suit. That translates directly to the canvas.
In Mexican culture, maintaining direct eye contact is a sign of immense strength, honesty, and defiance. She's looking right through the canvas at the viewer.
Contrast that with the traditional demure female portraits of the Renaissance or the Victorian era. Historically, the female subject is looking away, looking down, looking off into the distance.
Passively offering herself up to the male gaze of the viewer.
Exactly. But Frida Kahlo's gaze is a challenge. She refuses to be a passive object. She is saying, I see you seeing me. It's a total assertion of power.
Then we have the animals. If you look at photos of La Casa Azul, she surrounded herself with an absolute menagerie of pets in real life. Dogs, birds, monkeys, deer.
But on canvas, they aren't just cute companions. They act as emotional mirrors.
Let's decode the monkeys.
Sure. In traditional European art history, monkeys often symbolize lust, sin, or primal urges. But Kahlo completely repurposes them.
Because she suffered traumatic, life-threatening miscarriages and was unable to carry a child to term due to the damage to her pelvis from the bus accident.
Right, so the monkeys often function in her paintings as substitute children.
They are almost always depicted with their long arms wrapped around her neck or waist, providing the physical comfort and maternal connection she desperately craved, but was biologically denied.
Conversely, she frequently painted black cats.
Right. And in Mexican folklore, as in many global cultures, black cats represent bad luck, dark magic, or impending doom.
So when a black cat appears perched on her shoulder in a portrait, it is a direct, coded acknowledgement that she is currently navigating an incredibly dark, difficult period in her life.
The most haunting animal symbol for me reading through this list is the hummingbird. In Mexican culture, hummingbirds are generally considered beautiful talismans for good luck and love. They are vibrant, fast, full of life.
But Frida Kahlo doesn't paint live, fluttering hummingbirds.
She paints them dead.
Yes. A dead hummingbird, stiff and lifeless, hanging from a necklace or resting near her throat, is a stark, incredibly bitter symbol. It represents dead luck and romance, the death of hope in a relationship.
We also see butterflies and dragonflies scattered throughout her work. Our sources suggest these are her symbols for transformation and resurrection.
They tend to appear when she is processing a physical recovery or a profound shift in her personal identity.
But perhaps the most radical, boundary-pushing symbolism she employed was her medical imagery.
Oh, this is where she truly broke the mold of Western art. She proudly, painstakingly painted the torturous orthopedic corset she had to wear.
She painted exposed anatomy-beating hearts outside the chest, shattered spinal columns masquerading as ruined Greek columns, intricate arterial systems.
She painted her surgical incisions and her bloody sheets.
She refused to hide the medical trauma in the shadows. She made it the absolute focal point of the composition. She took the most grotesque, agonizing aspects of her medical reality and transformed them into undeniable artistic triumphs.
And she color-coded all this emotion to ensure the viewer understood the exact frequency of her pain.
Like the red.
Yeah, red wasn't just a bold aesthetic choice. It was literal blood,
Yeah.
physical passion, and political Marxist revolution.
And the blue specifically, the cobalt Frida blue of her house walls, represented deep sadness, infinity, and an unbreakable connection to her Mexican identity.
Yellow was the color of madness, sickness, but occasionally the optimism of the sun. Green connected her back to the lush, life-giving earth of Mexico.
Let's put all this theory into practice and walk through how this language operates in a single, unified piece. Let's look at one of her most famous works, Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird, painted in 1940.
Okay, visualize the composition. Frida is in the dead center, her expression completely stoic, her gaze locked onto yours with that challenging intensity we talked about.
Framing her face, taking up the entire background, is a dense, claustrophobic wall of lush, green, tropical leaves.
And around her neck, digging deeply into her skin, is a necklace made of thick, sharp, interwoven branches of thorns.
And her neck is visibly bleeding. Small, bright red drops of blood fall where the thorns pierce the flesh.
Hanging from the center of this thorn necklace, right at the hollow of her throat like a pendant, is a dead black hummingbird, its wings splayed open.
On her right shoulder sits a black spider monkey, and its small, human-like hands are physically pulling the thorn necklace, tugging at the branches, which causes the thorns to dig deeper and create more bleeding.
And on her left shoulder, perched ominously, is a black cat, its eyes wide, staring directly at the dead hummingbird.
If we decode this using her visual dictionary, the psychological narrative is overwhelming. The dead hummingbird tells us her romantic life has been entirely crushed.
The interwoven thorns draw a direct, undeniable line to the Christian crown of thorns, framing her immense emotional and physical suffering as a form of martyrdom.
But it also shows how she takes that agony and turns it into adornment. She wears her pain as jewelry.
Right. And the bleeding shows her absolute willingness to be vulnerable with the viewer, offering up her literal life force.
The monkey, her substitute child, the creature she loves, pulling the thorns tighter, represents how even her closest companions, the people she brings into her intimate universe, can inadvertently cause her immense pain.
While the black cat signals the overwhelming run of bad luck she is enduring.
But then you have to read the background, the lush, vibrant green foliage. Green is the earth. It signifies that despite the bleeding, despite the dead romance, the betrayal, and the bad luck, life and the fierce spirit of Mexico continues to grow relentlessly around her.
It is an absolute masterclass in psychological storytelling. And the timing of that specific painting is critical.
Our sources note it was completed in 1940.
Yes. Her symbolic language, the sheer density of these emotional codes, it peaked during the absolute most agonizing period of her personal life.
The late 1930s and 1940 brought the dissolution of her incredibly toxic, intensely passionate marriage. Diego Rivera had engaged in countless affairs, the most devastating being an affair with Frida's own younger sister, Cristina.
In 1939, Frida and Diego officially divorced.
And that divorce is the catalyst for two of her absolute largest, most impossibly complex masterpieces. These aren't just portraits. They are monumental testaments to duality, identity crisis, and pain.
Let's start with the one that is arguably her most famous canvas, The Two Fridas, painted in the immediate aftermath of the divorce in 1939.
The visual scale alone is striking. It's a double self-portrait, life-sized. Two Fridas are seated side by side on a simple green woven bench.
The background isn't the lush, life-affirming green foliage of the thorn necklace portrait. It is a dark, heavy, churning, apocalyptic, stormy sky.
The Frida on the left is wearing a very traditional, high-necked, lacy white, Victorian-style blouse and skirt. It's incredibly European.
While the Frida on the right is wearing the vibrant, deeply indigenous Tijuana dress with the embroidered bodice that we talked about earlier.
And both of their chests are cut open. Their hearts are completely exposed on the outside of their bodies.
The Tijuana Frida has a whole, anatomically intact heart. The Victorian Frida has a heart that is sliced wide open, the chambers and valves exposed and vulnerable.
They are physically connected by their cardiovascular systems. There is a single red blood vessel linking the two hearts.
It travels down the arm of the Tijuana Frida, whose hand rests in her lap, holding a tiny miniature portrait of Diego Rivera as a child.
The vein crosses over to the Victorian Frida, who is holding a pair of metallic surgical scissors, and she has literally clamped the vein shut and cut it. Bright red blood is dripping down, staining the pristine white lace of her Victorian dress.
It's so visceral. But if you look past the blood and the exposed organs, the most important detail, the conceptual anchor of the entire composition, is their hands.
Right.
The two Fridas are sitting there, amidst the storm and the bleeding, firmly, tightly holding each other's hands.
I really want to dive into the feminist analysis of this provided in our sources because reducing this to a painting about a bad breakup does it a massive disservice.
Oh, absolutely. We have to view this through the lens of patriarchal 1930s Mexico and the specific dynamics of the art world at that time. For her entire adult life, society, the media, and the public had defined her almost exclusively in relation to a man.
She was Diego Rivera's wife.
Exactly. The Tijuana Frida represents the woman Rivera loved and encouraged, the one steeped in Mexicanidad, the indigenous roots, the version of Frida that aligned with his muralist nationalist visions.
And the Victorian Frida, bleeding and severed, represents the European heritage, her German Jewish father's side, and the independent pre-Diego self that Rivera ultimately rejected.
When the divorce happened, it wasn't just the loss of a husband or domestic partnership. It was an absolute crisis of identity. If she wasn't Rivera's wife, the woman in the Tijuana dress he adored, who was she?
Society offered no framework for an independent, disabled, radically political female artist.
None. Which is why the hands holding each other are so revolutionary. The feminist theory suggests this isn't a painting of despair, it's a painting of profound realization and survival.
By holding her own hand, she is physically grounding herself. She's recognizing that despite the agonizing split in her identity, despite the bleeding out of her past life, she's ultimately the only one who can comfort and sustain herself.
She is declaring herself a whole, complete person entirely outside of the male gaze or the physical presence of a husband. She becomes her own support system, her own partner.
It's incredibly powerful. But while the two Fridas resolved with that gesture of self-comfort and stabilization, the second massive painting from this divorce period is pure, unadulterated trauma.
And this brings us back to the hook of our entire deep dive.
Yes, the missing masterpiece, The Wounded Table, painted in 1940.
This painting was her response to the International Exhibition of Surrealism held in Mexico City. She was working frantically to finish it by the deadline, desperate to express the absolute, chaotic despair of the divorce.
It was her largest painting to date, a massive horizontal canvas, and it is arranged almost exactly like Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper.
But instead of Christ and the serene apostles breaking bread, we have Frida at the center of an absolute nightmare.
The table they're sitting at isn't just a piece of furniture. It has long, muscular human legs, complete with flayed skin, exposing the tendons and muscle fibers.
And the wooden surface of the table is covered in knots. From those knots, real, thick blood is pooling and dripping down the front of the table onto the floor.
The table is a visceral, agonizing symbol of her entirely broken family, the destruction of her domestic life, and the physical ruin of her own body.
And sitting around this bleeding table, acting as the apostles of her suffering, are the fragmented pieces of her emotional world.
To her right sit her sister Christina's two children. Given that Christina was the one who had the affair with Diego, having her children at the table is a brutal reminder of the betrayal, while also representing Frida's own deeply unfulfilled desire for motherhood.
Next to them is her pet deer, Granizo, which she often treated and painted as a surrogate child.
On her immediate left is a massive Nayarit pre-Columbian clay figure. But Frida heavily altered it. She painted it with elongated, almost fluid arms that merged with her own arm, and she gave the ancient figure wooden peg legs,
which deeply physically links her indigenous Mexican roots directly to her own physical disabilities and her shattered body.
And towering over all of them, playing the role of Judas in this grotesque Last Supper, is a massive, incredibly tall papier-mâché Judas figure.
These are traditional effigies burned in Mexico during Holy Week. But this Judas is wearing a very specific outfit.
Blue denim overalls.
The exact signature overalls Diego Rivera wore every day to paint his murals. It is the ultimate, undeniable symbol of betrayal.
It is a staggering, overwhelming work of art. The psychological density is unmatched. And as we mentioned at the start, it is completely gone.
Just gone.
It was exhibited in Warsaw, Poland in 1955. It was donated to the Soviet Union by Kahlo herself as a gesture of international political solidarity. And then it simply vanished into the vast, opaque bureaucracy of the Cold War.
To this day, it remains the holy grail for Kahlo scholars. There are only black and white photographs of it.
The fact that a painting that large, that complex, featuring a bleeding table with flayed human legs can just vanish without a trace is wild. But its disappearance into the Soviet Union isn't just a random geographical footnote. It actually maps perfectly onto her real-life actions.
Because Frida Kahlo's entanglement with Soviet politics wasn't just theoretical or artistic or confined to donating a painting. It became incredibly, dangerously personal. Let's talk about the Leon Trotsky affair.
Yes, the Trotsky affair. This is a chapter of her life that perfectly illustrates how deeply she was embedded in the global political currents of her time, and how she used those currents for her own personal agency.
In the late 1930s, the Soviet Union is under the absolute iron grip of Joseph Stalin. Stalin had ruthlessly chased his primary political rival, the Marxist revolutionary and theorist Leon Trotsky, out of the country, condemning him to exile and hunting his supporters.
Trotsky is bouncing around the globe, desperately trying to find a country that will risk Stalin's wrath by granting him asylum. Almost no one will take him.
Enter Diego Rivera.
Rivera uses his immense cultural influence and political leverage to personally petition the Mexican president, Lázaro Cárdenas, to grant Trotsky safe haven in Mexico. And against the odds, it works.
In January 1937, Leon Trotsky and his wife, Natalia Sedova, arrived by ship in Mexico, and who was waiting at the heavily guarded port of Tampico to greet this world historical figure.
Frida Kahlo.
Rivera and Kahlo didn't just welcome them to the country, they offered them a fortress to live in. They moved the Trotskys directly into La Casa Azul.
The literal architect of the Russian Revolution, a man hunted by assassins, is now living in the cobalt blue intimate universe, surrounded by the pre-Hispanic sculptures and the monkey cages.
The living arrangement forced the two couples to spend a massive amount of time together. They dined together, discussed politics, and traveled to archaeological sites.
And by the early summer of 1937, Kahlo and Trotsky began a highly secret, incredibly risky love affair right under the noses of their respective spouses.
I'm reading the letters in the archive, and she affectionately, almost teasingly, called the hardened, bearded Russian revolutionary the old man, or Piochitas, which translates to little goat, referring to his goatee.
But you really have to analyze her motivations here, because this isn't just a simple romance.
It was a profound intersection of politics, power, and revenge. Trotsky was a man of immense global intellectual stature. He was brilliant. He was a historical heavyweight. For a politically engaged woman like Kahlo, his mind was deeply attractive.
But let's be honest about the domestic situation. Kahlo knew absolutely that sleeping with one of the most famous men on the planet, an intellectual giant that her husband deeply revered under her husband's own roof, was the ultimate way to make the notoriously unfaithful, egotistical Diego Rivera insanely jealous.
You have a masterful power play. She was reclaiming her sexual and political agency in a marriage where she had constantly been marginalized by Rivera's infidelities.
But the flame burned out incredibly quickly, right?
Very quickly. By July of that same year, Kahlo had grown tired of the old man, his clinginess, and the stress of the secrecy. She abruptly ended the affair.
She didn't just quietly dump him and move on either. She commemorated the entire event and asserted her absolute dominance over the situation with a painting.
It's called Self-Portrait, dedicated to Leon Trotsky, also known as Between the Curtains, painted in 1937. And she gave it to him for his birthday in November.
Visually, it is one of her softest, warmest, and most traditionally flattering portraits. She's holding a delicate bouquet of flowers, standing confidently between two sheer white curtains that look almost like a theater stage.
The colors are inviting. She looks incredibly beautiful, seductive, and totally in control.
And in her hand, she is holding a piece of paper with a formal dedication. It reads, "To Leon Trotsky, with all my love, I dedicate this painting on 7th November, 1937, Frida Kahlo in St. Angel, Mexico."
Trotsky was reportedly thrilled and captivated by it. He hung it prominently on the wall in his study in the Blue House.
But the aftermath of this gift is almost comical and deeply human.
In 1939, when the political and personal tensions finally boiled over, forcing Trotsky and his wife to move out of Casa Azul to another house in Coyoacan, Natalia Sedova, who was by then well aware of the affair, absolutely refused to let him take the painting.
She commanded him to leave it behind. I want to just pause and marvel at the sheer audacity of this woman. She is living in the patriarchal society of 1930s Mexico. She invites a world historical revolutionary, a man hiding from Stalin's assassins, into her home.
She initiates a secret affair with him under the nose of her world-famous overbearing husband.
She gets bored of him. She dumps him. She paints a stunning, incredibly confident portrait of herself, signs it with all my love, hands it to him as a souvenir of their tryst, and eventually his wife is so furious she makes him abandon it.
It completely and utterly shatters the image of Frida Kahlo as a tragic, weeping victim confined to a bed, suffering at the hands of men. She was a brilliant political operative, an unparalleled artist, and an incredibly calculating, dominant player in her own romantic and intellectual life.
Looking back at everything we've unpacked from this massive stack of sources today, the trajectory of her life is staggering. We started with the image of a young woman, her spine and pelvis shattered, poured into a plaster cast, confined to a bed with a mirror mounted on the ceiling above her.
The ultimate literal image of restriction and paralysis.
And from that total restriction, she built a universe that impacted global art history. She curated a physical space in La Casa Azul that preserved her indigenous heritage against the tide of Eurocentric modernism.
She weaponized her wardrobe, using men's tailoring and traditional Tehuana dresses to completely redefine gender presentation and champion radical post-revolution politics.
She invented a secret, codified visual language. The surrogate monkeys, the dead hummingbirds signifying romantic ruin, the bleeding thorns, the exposed hearts, to force a deeply uncomfortable world to look directly at her physical and emotional agony.
She took the trauma of a devastating divorce and turned it into monumental canvases that declared her a whole, independent person.
And she entangled herself with the highest, most dangerous levels of global communist revolution, using figures like Trotsky as players in her own domestic drama.
Which brings us back to you, the listener, and the Kahlo cult we mentioned at the very beginning of this deep dive. When you walk through a department store today or scroll through social media and you see her image reduced to a stylized unibrow and a bright floral crown printed on a pair of socks, or a coffee cup, or a fast fashion t-shirt, remember what has been deliberately erased to make that product sellable.
Mainstream culture, driven by the very capitalism she despised, loves to simplify women's stories. They strip away the radical Marxist politics. They strip away the unapologetic bisexuality and the bold sexual agency.
They strip away the communist flags draping her coffin.
And most of all, they strip away the uncomfortable, bleeding, surgical reality of the disabled female body just to make the image easy, pretty, and harmless to consume. They try to turn a revolutionary bomb into a decorative ribbon.
By understanding her precise symbols, her fierce politics, and her absolute refusal to compromise her painful reality for the comfort of male critics or society, you ensure that her actual legacy survives the commercialization.
And to leave you with one final provocative thought that proves just how completely obsessively dedicated she was to crafting her own myth. Frida Kahlo was born in 1907.
That is a heavily documented, undesirable historical fact on her birth certificate.
But later in life, after she had become a political force and a cultural icon, she actively and repeatedly lied about her birth date. She began officially claiming and writing on documents that she was born in 1910.
The choice of 1910 wasn't vanity, it was profound political theater, because 1910 was the exact year the Mexican Revolution began.
She literally rewrote the factual biological beginning of her own life so that her very existence would be perfectly symbolically aligned with the violent, transformative birth of a new revolutionary Mexico. She wasn't just born, she decided she was forged in the fire of a revolution. Consider that the next time you look at one of her self-portraits, or even the next time you post a picture of yourself online, how much of your own identity are you actively curating for the world to see? And if your reality was painted as a masterpiece, would it be a neat, easily categorized aesthetic, or would it be a chaotic, bleeding table that fiercely defies definition?